The greatest threat to the German Empire was not the British Navy or the Russian army. It was the blood that flowed through the veins of one of its own princes. His name was Prince Waldemar, and from birth, an assassin lived inside him, a hereditary traitor who turned his own blood into a weapon against him. It turned a parade ground into a minefield and a simple fall into a death sentence. Heir to millions of loyal soldiers, but commanded a body in a constant state of rebellion. Each dawn was a coin toss between life and a fatal hemorrhage. His titles were meaningless. His legacy was a curse. This is the story of that civil war, of a prince whose most dangerous enemy was one he could never quite see. In the final years of the 19th century, the German Empire, the Kaiser Reich, was a titan forged in the crucible of blood and iron. It was young, born only in 1871, yet it pulsed with an industrial and military vigor that unsettled the old powers of Europe. Its heart was Prussia, a kingdom whose very identity was synonymous with martial discipline, duty, and conquest. At the helm of this formidable new power stood Kaiser Wilhelm II, a man as complex and volatile as the nation he ruled. Impetuous, intelligent, and profoundly insecure, Wilhelm II envisioned a German destiny that stretched across the globe, challenging the naval supremacy of his own grandmother, Britain's Queen Victoria. The world of the Hohenzollern dynasty was one of gleaming steel, spiked helmets, and the unshakable belief that a prince's highest calling was to lead men into battle for the glory of the fatherland. For the male children born into this royal house, life was not a series of choices, but a preordained path of service, sacrifice, and command. The cradle was but a brief stop on the way to the saddle and the barracks. But history, in its infinite and often cruel irony, does not always bend to the will of empires or the traditions of men. Within the gilded palaces and sprawling naval bases of this militaristic world, a different kind of story was unfolding, a quiet internal struggle far removed from the parade grounds and war rooms. It was a story of a prince born at the very center of this imperial machine, yet fundamentally excluded from its primary purpose. He was a nephew of the Kaiser, a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a vessel of Europe's most powerful blood. Yet this same blood, which granted him immense privilege, carried a hidden, insidious flaw. He was a prince destined to fight a war not against foreign armies, but against his own body, a relentless internal enemy that could strike without warning from the slightest misstep or fall. This is the story of a man forced to trade the sword for the book, the war horse for the quiet solitude of a country estate. This is the forgotten life of Prince Waldemar of Prussia, a tale of personal tragedy set against the backdrop of a dying world order, a deadly genetic curse, and the solitary quest for meaning in a life defined by limitations. On March 20th, 1889, in the city of Kiel, the naval jewel of the German Empire, a son was born to Prince Heinrich of Prussia and his wife Princess Irene of Hesse and by Rhine. The child's name was a litany of royal heritage: Waldemar Wilhelm Ludwig Friedrich Victor Heinrich. His father, Heinrich, was the younger, more affable, and pragmatic brother of the Kaiser, a dedicated career naval officer who rose to the rank of Grand Admiral and was deeply respected within the fleet. His mother, Princess Irene, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, a woman whose children and grandchildren sat on nearly every throne in Europe, creating a web of kinship that was supposed to guarantee peace but would soon prove tragically ineffective. To the family, this firstborn son, a boy with the blood of both the Hohenzollerns and the House of Hanover in his veins, was known simply and affectionately as Toddy. By every conceivable measure, Waldemar's future appeared luminous. As the son of the Kaiser's brother, he stood high in the line of succession. A life of command, prestige, and influence was not just a possibility, it was his birthright. He would follow in his father's footsteps, becoming an admiral in the burgeoning Imperial German Navy, or perhaps a general in the vaunted Prussian army. He would be a pillar of the dynasty, a living symbol of the empire's strength. From the moment he drew his first breath in the Grand Kiel Castle, overlooking the bustling shipyards and the steely gray waters of the Baltic Sea, his destiny seemed as solid and unchangeable as the granite fortresses that guarded the harbor. But Princess Irene, along with her royal lineage, had passed down something else to her son. It was an invisible inheritance, a genetic time bomb that had already brought tragedy to her own family and was quietly spreading through the royal houses of the continent. It was the royal disease, Hemophilia B, a rare and brutal disorder that prevents the blood from clotting. A simple cut that would be a minor nuisance for another child could become a life-threatening event. A bruise from a playful tumble could lead to massive internal bleeding, crippling joints, and causing excruciating pain. In an age before modern medicine understood blood types, clotting factors, or the science of transfusions, a diagnosis of hemophilia was a virtual death sentence, a life lived under constant mortal threat. For the House of Hohenzollern, this was more than a medical crisis. It was a matter of profound dynastic shame. In the hyper-masculine culture of Prussian militarism, strength and physical perfection were prized above all else. The ideal Prussian prince was a robust athletic figure, capable of enduring the rigors of military life and projecting an image of unassailable power. A frail, sickly prince was an aberration, a stain on the family's honor and a symbol of weakness that could not be tolerated. This unspoken pressure was magnified tenfold by the personality of Waldemar's uncle, the Kaiser. Wilhelm II's own traumatic birth had left him with a permanently withered and near useless left arm, a disability he spent his entire life desperately trying to conceal and overcompensate for. He developed a bombastic, aggressive persona, obsessing over military uniforms, grand parades, and displays of masculine bravado. His pathological disgust for any form of physical imperfection was well known in the family. For Wilhelm, a hemophiliac nephew was not just a family tragedy. He was a walking, breathing reminder of the very weakness he despised in himself and sought to eradicate from the German spirit. Thus, Waldemar's childhood became a carefully managed secret, a life lived within a golden cage, while his healthy cousins, including the Kaiser's own sons, were taught to ride horses, hunt wild boar, and engage in mock battles. Waldemar's world was circumscribed by fear. His playgrounds were the opulent but confining interiors of the family's residences in Kiel and Potsdam. Every sharp corner of a table, every staircase, every cobblestone in the courtyard represented a potential threat. His mother, Irene, having already lost her own brother, Prince Friedrich, to the same disease in 1873 after he fell from a window, lived in a state of perpetual anxiety. She wrapped her son in a cocoon of protection, shielding him from the rough and tumble world that was supposed to forge a Prussian prince. This enforced isolation had a profound effect on the young boy's development. Denied the physical outlets available to his peers, he turned inward, finding refuge and stimulation in the world of the mind. He became a voracious reader, devouring books on history, literature, and science. His intellect, sharpened by solitude and study, became his primary tool for engaging with the world. Instead of attending a military academy, he was privately educated in a special classroom established within the Kiel Palace, the Schlossklasse. There, under the guidance of carefully selected tutors, he studied not military tactics and ballistics, but law, economics, and political philosophy. While his cousins inherited the sword, he was handed the pen, not as a weapon of state, but as the gilded emblem of his exclusion. Yet in the heart of a boy raised to believe that glory was found on the battlefield, this alternate path, however necessary, must have sowed the seeds of inadequacy and alienation. He could hear the drums and trumpets from the parade ground. He could see the other boys in their crisp cadet uniforms. And he knew, with a certainty that must have been crushing, that he could never join them. The abstract fear that had governed his entire childhood became a horrific, tangible reality in 1904. Waldemar was 15 years old when his younger brother, 4-year-old Prince Heinrich, was born in 1900. Like Waldemar, Heinrich had also inherited the family's curse. One day, the little boy was playing and suffered a simple fall, hitting his head. For any other child, it would have resulted in a bump, a few tears, and perhaps a scolding. But for Heinrich, it was a fatal blow. The impact caused a cerebral hemorrhage, an internal bleed in his brain. The family doctors were summoned, but they were helpless. They could only watch as the bleeding continued, unchecked and unstoppable, building pressure within the boy's skull. Prince Heinrich died the next day. The death of his little brother was the defining trauma of Waldemar's young life. It was a brutal, intimate confirmation of his own fragility. The curse was not a distant threat. It was a predator that lived within his own family, one that had now claimed the life of the person closest to him. The grief that enveloped his parents, particularly his mother, would have been a constant, somber presence. For Waldemar, the loss was compounded by a chilling realization. He was next. Every headache, every nosebleed, every accidental bump would now be accompanied by a surge of terror. His brother's fate was a constant reminder of what could and likely would happen to him. The abstract ghost of his condition now had a face, the face of his dead brother, and it would sit beside him at every table for the rest of his life. With his brother gone, the family's protective instincts around Waldemar intensified. The path laid out for him was now the only one possible. When he came of age, he was enrolled not in the Prussian military academy at Lichterfelde, but at university. He studied law and political science first at the Kaiser Wilhelm Universität in Strasbourg, and later at the Christian Albrechts Universität in his home city of Kiel. This was a radical departure from Hohenzollern tradition. He was the first Prussian prince in living memory to pursue a full academic degree in a civilian field. He proved to be an able student, diligent and intelligent, absorbing the complexities of constitutional law and public administration. He was preparing himself for the only role the empire could offer him, a bureaucrat in a prince's uniform. He would be a man of papers and committees, an expert in the machinery of state, while his cousins and peers pursued the path of glory. He was being meticulously prepared for a life in the wings, a supporting role on the grand stage of history, forever watching the main action from a safe but lonely distance. Having been carefully guided down a path of scholarship and law, Prince Waldemar entered adulthood as a man uniquely prepared for a world of peaceful administration. But the world he was entering was not peaceful. As the intricate web of European alliances began to fray and the drums of war grew louder, the German Empire would soon call upon its princes to fulfill their highest duty on the battlefield. For a man whose entire life had been a battle against his own blood, the looming global conflict would present the ultimate challenge: how to serve a nation that worshipped warriors when he could never be one himself. As the 20th century unfolded, the world that had shaped Prince Waldemar's cloistered youth was accelerating towards a precipice. The years following his brother's tragic death were a period of deceptive tranquility in Europe, a long golden afternoon soon to be shattered by the thunder of cannons. Waldemar completed his university studies, earning a doctorate in law and emerging as a young man of considerable intellect and quiet dignity. He was now Dr. Waldemar, a scholar prince, a curiosity within the rigidly militaristic hierarchy of the Hohenzollern court. He would attend the grand functions in Berlin, a tall, slender figure in the formal attire of a royal, yet he always remained slightly apart from the boisterous circle of uniformed officers who were his cousins and peers. While they discussed cavalry tactics and naval gunnery, he was more comfortable debating legal theory or the economic policies of Bismarck. He lived the life of a prince, residing in palaces attended by servants, his name carrying the weight of centuries of power. But he was an outsider in his own home, a man defined not by his abilities, but by the one thing he could not do: fight. This sense of separation would have been acutely felt in his relationship with his family. His father, Prince Heinrich, continued his ascent through the ranks of the Imperial Navy, a beloved and competent commander who embodied the naval ambitions of the Kaiserreich. His younger brother, Sigismund, born in 1896 and thankfully free of the hemophiliac gene, was a healthy, energetic boy, being groomed for the naval career that Waldemar could never have. The family dynamic, though loving, was surely underscored by this fundamental difference. Sigismund was the future, the continuation of the family's martial legacy. Waldemar was the beloved but fragile elder son, a man to be protected, not a warrior to be deployed. Meanwhile, the gears of war were grinding across the continent. The naval arms race between Germany and Great Britain, a personal obsession of both the Kaiser and Waldemar's father, filled the shipyards of Kiel with the clang of hammers and the skeletons of new dreadnoughts. A web of entangling alliances, the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain, pitted against the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, turned Europe into a continental powder keg. Every diplomatic crisis in the Balkans, every colonial dispute in Africa, sent tremors through the capitals of Europe. For the princes of the House of Hohenzollern, this rising tension was not a source of fear, but of exhilarating anticipation. This was their calling, the moment they had been trained for since birth. War was the ultimate test of a man, a nation, and a dynasty. In the summer of 1914, the spark was finally lit. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo triggered the catastrophic domino effect of the alliance system. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to protect its Slavic ally. Germany, bound by treaty to Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia and its ally France. When German armies violated Belgian neutrality to invade France, Great Britain declared war on Germany. Within weeks, the long peace was over, and the continent was consumed by a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality, the Great War. A tidal wave of patriotic fervor, the Geist von 1914, swept across Germany. The Kaiser's declaration that he no longer saw parties, only Germans, united the nation in a powerful, if temporary, bond. In Berlin, cheering crowds filled the streets, singing patriotic songs and throwing flowers at the soldiers marching to the railway stations. For the royal family, This was their moment of supreme duty. The Kaiser's 6 sons all took up commands. Crown Prince Wilhelm was given nominal command of the Fifth Army. Prince Eitel Friedrich commanded the 1st Foot Guards. Prince Adalbert served in the Navy. Waldemar's own family was at the heart of the war effort. His father, Grand Admiral Prince Heinrich, was made the supreme commander of the German naval forces in the Baltic Sea, tasked with confronting the Russian fleet. His younger brother, Sigismund, barely 18, enlisted as a naval officer, ready to serve. And where was Waldemar? At 25 years old, he was a man in the prime of his life, a prince of the ruling house. In the eyes of the public and the court, his absence from the front lines would have been unthinkable, a dereliction of the most sacred duty. And so, a role was found for him. It was a carefully constructed fiction, a position designed to give him the appearance of a soldier while ensuring he was never exposed to the slightest physical danger. Officially, he was given an honorary rank in the Navy, Capitaine Lieutenant à la suite der Marine. The phrase à la suite was key. It meant he was attached to the Navy in a ceremonial capacity, holding the rank and entitled to wear the uniform, but without any actual command or operational duties at sea. The risk of a splinter from an exploding shell or even a fall on a pitching deck was far too great. His naval career was a career on paper only. His actual wartime service was with the Army, in a role meticulously tailored to his condition, leading the Freiwilligen Automobile Corps, Volunteer Motor Corps. Under the command of the General Staff, this logistical unit handled transport, not combat, keeping him safely behind the lines. The dawn of the 20th century had brought motorized warfare, and the Army had a desperate need for vehicles and skilled drivers to transport staff officers, ferry vital dispatches, move supplies, and evacuate the wounded. Waldemar's role was administrative and organizational. From a headquarters safely behind the lines, he would have managed the deployment of vehicles, coordinated maintenance schedules, and handled the immense paperwork that is the unglamorous backbone of any army. It was essential work, a genuine contribution to the war effort, but in the rigid, glory-obsessed hierarchy of the Prussian military, it was invisible. The currency of honor was the Iron Cross, earned for bravery under fire, not the meticulous management of a motor pool. While his peers and cousins were leading charges from trenches, dodging machine gun fire at Ypres, or facing British shells at the Battle of Jutland, Waldemar was fighting a war of timetables and spare parts. He wore the same field gray uniform, but his hands were stained with ink, not with the mud of Flanders. One can only imagine the profound internal conflict that must have consumed him. Every letter from home would have brought news of his brother Sigismund's service at sea or his father's strategic maneuvers in the Baltic. Every newspaper headline would have celebrated the heroic and often fictionalized deeds of his royal cousins at the front. He was surrounded by the language and ethos of war, yet utterly removed from its reality. Was he plagued by guilt, the feeling that he was a shirker while others died for the fatherland? Did he feel a sense of burning frustration at the genetic lottery that had condemned him to this safe but emasculating role? Or was there also a quiet sense of relief, the knowledge that he was spared the horrific industrialized slaughter that was consuming a generation of European men? Most likely it was a confusing and painful mixture of all these things. He was living a paradox, a prince of the most militaristic state in Europe who could not be a soldier, a man trapped in the role of the soldier in name only. As the war dragged on, the initial patriotic euphoria curdled into a grim slog of attrition. The quick, decisive victory promised by the Kaiser never materialized. The Western Front became a static line of trenches, a hellscape of mud, rats, poison gas, and senseless death. On the home front, the British naval blockade slowly starved Germany into submission. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was known as the Kohlruben Winter, the Turnip Winter, as the German people were forced to subsist on little more than turnips due to catastrophic food shortages. The nation that had marched to war with such confidence was now exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. In November 1918, after 4 long years of horrific bloodshed, the German war machine finally broke. The failure of the final German offensive in the spring, combined with the arrival of fresh American troops, had turned the tide decisively. The German High Command informed the Kaiser that the war was lost and that he must seek an armistice. But it was too late. The German people had lost faith in their leaders. The final catalyst for collapse came from Waldemar's own hometown, the naval base of Kiel. On October 29, 1918, sailors of the German High Seas Fleet, ordered to set out for a final suicidal battle against the Royal Navy, refused to obey. The Kiel mutiny spread like wildfire, igniting revolutionary sparks across the country. Workers' and soldiers' councils, modeled on the Russian Soviets, sprang up in city after city. The revolution swept away the old order with astonishing speed. On November 9, 1918, with Berlin in the grip of a general strike, the Kaiser was forced to abdicate. He fled into exile in the Netherlands the next day. The German Empire, the proud Kaiserreich, that had been proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles less than 50 years before, ceased to exist. In its place, a new, fragile German republic, later to be known as the Weimar Republic, was declared. For Waldemar, the collapse was not just a political event, it was the utter disintegration of his world. The empire he had served in his own limited way was gone. The monarchy that had given his life its structure and purpose was abolished. The 500-year rule of the House of Hohenzollern was over. His honorary military career was finished. The titles of Prince of Royal Highness were now meaningless honorifics in a nation that had rejected its kings. At the age of 29, he found himself adrift in a new and hostile world. He was no longer a prince with a defined, if restricted, role. He was simply a private citizen in a defeated, chaotic, and revolutionary Germany. The carefully constructed life he had led, the gilded cage and the safe career, had been shattered. Before him lay not a clear path, but a void. Stripped of his title, his uniform, and his imperial destiny, Waldemar had to face a future where the only battle left to fight was for his own survival. The sudden and total collapse of the German Empire in November 1918 did more than end a war. It obliterated Waldemar's entire world. Stripped of his royal title, his honorary military career, and the very institution that had given his life its context and purpose, he was now a private citizen in a defeated and revolutionary nation. From the ashes of this fallen world, he had to forge a new existence, seeking not glory or national destiny, but a measure of personal peace and stability in an age of unprecedented chaos. The German Empire was dead, its Kaiser in exile, its armies defeated. In its place rose the Weimar Republic, a democracy born in the crucible of humiliation and chaos. The first years of its existence were a maelstrom of political violence, economic collapse, and social upheaval. In the streets of Berlin, extremist factions of the left and right battled for control. The Spartacist uprising, led by communists, was brutally crushed by the Freikorps, paramilitary units of disgruntled right-wing war veterans. Political assassinations were commonplace for the members of the old aristocracy, and especially the dethroned House of Hohenzollern. This was a terrifying new reality. They were symbols of a hated old regime. stripped of their power and privilege, their very lives now potentially at risk. Their properties were threatened with expropriation, and their names, once revered, were now targets of scorn for many. It was in this turbulent and uncertain landscape that Waldemar, now a private citizen, had to build a new life from the ruins of the old. While some of his relatives dabbled in reactionary politics, dreaming of a monarchist restoration, Waldemar turned away from the grand and now broken stage of history. He sought solace and stability not in political intrigue, but in the most fundamental of human institutions, family. On August 14th, 1919, in a ceremony that could not have been more different from the opulent royal weddings of the pre-war era, the 30-year-old Waldemar was married. The wedding took place at Hemophiliac, his family's beloved country estate in Schleswig-Holstein, a quiet sanctuary far from the revolutionary fervor of the capital. His bride was Princess Calixta of Lippe-Biesterfeld, a woman of 24, who possessed a quiet strength and immense courage. For a Hohenzollern wedding, the event was remarkably modest and subdued, a private affair for a family in mourning for its lost world. Yet for Waldemar, this union represented a profound act of hope and a new beginning. Amidst the ashes of the fallen empire, he was laying the first stone of a new personal foundation. Princess Calixta's decision to marry Waldemar was, in itself, an act of extraordinary love and commitment. She was not marrying a future king or a celebrated war hero. She was marrying a man from a fallen dynasty, a man whose future was uncertain, and most significantly, a man who lived under the constant shadow of a deadly disease. She knew everything about his hemophilia. She understood that their life together would be governed by caution, that any accident could lead to tragedy, and that his lifespan was likely to be cut short. She was willingly stepping into the role of a caregiver, a protector, choosing a life with a man whose physical fragility was a central, unchangeable fact of their existence. Her choice speaks volumes about her character and the depth of their bond. In a world that had become violent and unpredictable, they chose to create a small, private world of mutual support and devotion. The couple settled into a quiet life, dividing their time between the various family properties. But one significant aspect came to define their marriage. It was childless. Some online genealogical records, prone to error, incorrectly list a daughter, but all authoritative royal almanacs and historical sources confirm that Waldemar and Calixta had no children. We cannot know with certainty the intimate reasons for this, as they left no diaries or letters on the subject. However, given Waldemar's life experience, we can surmise that this was a deliberate and deeply poignant choice. He had witnessed firsthand the terror the royal disease could inflict. He had seen the decades of anxiety in his mother's eyes. He carried the indelible scar of his 4-year-old brother's agonizing death. To have a child would be to risk passing on this terrible curse. A daughter would have a 50% chance of being a carrier, destined to live with the same fear his mother had endured. A son would have a 50% chance of being born with the disease itself, condemned to a life of pain, restriction, and the likelihood of an early death. Having lived that life himself, it is almost certain that Waldemar could not bear to inflict it upon a child of his own. He had inherited a curse, and his final act of defiance as a prince was to ensure it would be buried with him. It was a final silent act of service, not to an empire, but to a future generation he would never know. As the 1920s roared on, Germany experienced a period of wild contradictions. The nation was racked by hyperinflation so severe that money became worthless, with people carrying cash in wheelbarrows to buy a loaf of bread. Yet it was also a time of explosive cultural creativity, the era of Bauhaus architecture, Marlene Dietrich, and the avant-garde art of Berlin. Waldemar remained entirely aloof from this decadent, chaotic world. He retreated ever deeper into private life, completely abandoning any lingering political ambitions that might have been expected of a man of his standing. He chose the life of a country gentleman, a land manager. In 1926, he took over the administration of the Hemophiliac estate, a vast refuge of forests and farmland. The prince, once trained in constitutional law, now immersed himself in the practicalities of agriculture and forestry, finding a new purpose in the soil. His days were filled not with court ceremonies or state papers, but with crop rotation schedules, timber harvests, and the management of tenant farmers. The descendant of Frederick the Great was now a squire, his boots covered in the soil of his land, his concerns tied to the rhythm of the seasons rather than the politics of the nation. There is a profound sense that in this new, simpler life, Waldemar may have found a measure of peace that had always eluded him. The pressures of his royal identity were gone. He no longer had to live in the shadow of his war hero father or his intimidating uncle, the Kaiser. The crippling expectation to be a robust, masculine military leader, an expectation his body could never fulfill, had vanished with the empire itself. At Hemophiliac, his worth was not measured by his ability to ride a horse or command a regiment, but by his careful stewardship of the land. Here, his sharp administrative mind, honed by his legal studies, was a genuine asset. He could be useful, productive, and respected for who he was, not for what he was supposed to be. In the quiet solitude of the countryside, surrounded by the enduring cycles of nature, he may have finally learned to accept the fragility of his own body, not as a source of shame, but simply as a condition of his existence. The prince, who was born to rule a kingdom of men, found a quiet peace ruling a kingdom of soil and seasons. This period of relative stability was punctuated by a final somber milestone of the old world. In 1929, his father, Prince Heinrich, passed away. The pragmatic sailor prince, who had commanded fleets for an empire that no longer existed, was gone. As the eldest son, the full responsibility for managing the family's remaining assets and affairs now fell to Waldemar. He assumed the role of the head of his branch of the family with the same quiet diligence he applied to his estates. The duty was no longer to a crown or a nation, but to his mother, his wife, and his brother. The scale of his world had shrunk dramatically from the global ambitions of the Kaiserreich to the boundaries of his family's properties. Yet, within that smaller world, he had found a new and tangible purpose. He was no longer Prince Waldemar of Prussia, a cog in an imperial machine. He was the master of Hemophiliac, the husband of Calixta, the head of a fallen house, and a man who had, against all odds, carved out a life of quiet dignity amidst the ashes. By the late 1920s, Waldemar had successfully navigated the turbulent aftermath of the empire's fall, building a quiet and meaningful life for himself as a country squire, far from the political intrigues of Berlin. Yet the fragile peace he had carefully constructed was not destined to last. As Germany reeled from the Great Depression, a new and far more menacing political storm was gathering, one that would consume the nation in a totalitarian ideology. This rising tide of Nazism would test his strategy of quiet seclusion and force him to find a way to survive in a regime even more brutal than the one he was born into. The fragile peace Waldemar had found in the quiet rhythms of his country estate was not destined to last. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, Germany and the world were plunged into the Great Depression. The economic collapse shattered the Weimar Republic's remaining stability, creating a breeding ground for political extremism. Millions were unemployed, savings were wiped out, and the German people, still bearing the psychological scars of their defeat in the Great War and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, grew desperate for a savior. It was in this climate of fear and resentment that another, far more malevolent storm began to gather on the horizon: the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. In January 1933, the storm broke. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within months, the democratic framework of the Weimar Republic was systematically dismantled, replaced by the totalitarian madness of the Third Reich. Nazi flags, with their stark black swastikas, began to dominate the streets. The liberal, chaotic, and creative atmosphere of the Weimar era was extinguished, replaced by a rigid ideology of racial purity, nationalistic fervor, and absolute obedience to one man, the Führer. For the German people, and particularly for the old aristocracy, this new regime presented a complex and dangerous choice. Many members of Germany's old royal and noble families, including several of the Hohenzollerns, were initially drawn to the Nazis. They despised the liberal democracy of the Weimar Republic, which had stripped them of their power and status. They saw in Hitler a powerful figure who promised to restore Germany's national pride, rebuild the military, and crush the threat of communism. Some harbored the naive and ultimately delusional hope that Hitler, once in power, might even restore the monarchy, viewing him as a temporary strongman who would pave the way for their return. They saw the Nazis' emphasis on tradition, order, and national glory as an echo of their own past. One of the most prominent examples was Waldemar's own cousin, Prince August Wilhelm of Prussia, the fourth son of the exiled Kaiser. Known as a WWII within the family, he became an enthusiastic and high-profile supporter of the Nazi Party, joining in 1930 and eventually holding the rank of Obergruppenführer in the SA, the party's paramilitary wing. He appeared at rallies, gave speeches, and used his royal name to lend a veneer of aristocratic respectability to the thuggish Nazi movement. For a time, he was a useful propaganda tool for Hitler. Waldemar was different. He charted a course of absolute neutrality and deliberate obscurity. While his cousin was marching in brown shirt parades, Waldemar remained secluded on his estates, focused solely on the preservation of his family and his land. He did not collaborate with the Nazis, nor did he join the circles of active resistance. He simply withdrew, making himself as invisible as possible. Some later, more dramatic accounts of his life have attempted to paint him as a clandestine political dissident who had secret clashes with the Gestapo, but there is no historical evidence to support these claims. His lifelong war had been waged against the treachery in his own blood. He had no strength left to fight the wars of madmen. He possessed neither the physical stamina nor the political inclination for such a dangerous game. His strategy was one of survival through silence. He understood, perhaps better than his more politically ambitious relatives, the true nature of the Nazi regime. It was a movement that tolerated no rivals and had no genuine intention of sharing power or restoring the old monarchy. For Hitler, the old royals were instruments to be used and discarded at will. By embracing the Nazis, men like August Wilhelm were making a Faustian bargain, trading their legacy for a fleeting moment of perceived influence. They would soon learn that the Führer had no loyalty to anyone but himself. August Wilhelm, like many other early aristocratic supporters, was eventually sidelined and fell out of favor once Hitler had consolidated his absolute power. Waldemar's seclusion was the most intelligent course of action. By not drawing attention to himself, by being politically irrelevant, he protected himself and his family from the regime's unpredictable and often lethal purges. He focused on his work managing the estates of Hemophiliac and, from 1941, the large estate of Kamieniec in Silesia, modern-day Kamieniec Ząbkowicki, Poland. This Silesian property was a magnificent neo-Gothic palace that had belonged to his mother's side of the family. Managing these vast agricultural holdings in the highly regulated and demanding wartime economy of the Third Reich would have been a full-time challenge requiring all of his administrative skill. He had to navigate Nazi agricultural policies, production quotas, and the constant threat of state interference. Life under the Nazis was a process of holding one's breath, of waiting for the madness to pass. The regime's obsession with genetic purity and the creation of a master race must have been particularly chilling for Waldemar. The Nazi euthanasia programs, which targeted the physically and mentally disabled, were a terrifying manifestation of the state's ideology. While these programs were primarily aimed at ordinary citizens in institutions, the underlying principle, that physical imperfection was a stain on the nation that must be eliminated, was a horrifying echo of the very prejudice he had faced within his own family and the Prussian court. His flawed blood made him, in the eyes of the Nazis, fundamentally unworthy. His quiet, unassuming life was his best defense. As Hitler plunged Germany and the world into a second, even more catastrophic war in 1939, Waldemar's world shrank further. The war brought new hardships and dangers. Young men from his estates were conscripted into the Wehrmacht, many never to return. Resources were scarce. The ever-present eyes and ears of the local Nazi Party officials and the Gestapo meant that any careless word or action could lead to denunciation and arrest. Waldemar and Calixta lived an isolated life, their days governed by the quiet management of their properties and the constant low-level anxiety of living under a brutal dictatorship. He was simply trying to keep his small world intact while the larger world tore itself apart. He had survived the collapse of one empire. Now he was silently enduring the rise and reign of another, 1,000-year Reich, whose foundations were built on terror and whose destiny was self-destruction. He held his breath, hoping to outlast the storm. But the storm of this war, unlike any before it, would not pass him by. It would hunt him down in his final refuge and deliver the final tragic blow. For 12 years, Waldemar's strategy of quiet obscurity had served him well, allowing him and his family to survive the treacherous political landscape of the Third Reich. By remaining invisible, he had weathered the storm of Nazi rule. But as the 1,000-year Reich collapsed into a Götterdämmerung of fire and vengeance in 1945, there was no longer a safe harbor. The final chaotic death throes of the war would force him from his last refuge and set him on a desperate journey that would lead to a final tragic confrontation with fate. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, the 1,000-year Reich was in its death throes, collapsing into a vortex of unimaginable violence and chaos. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army, an unstoppable behemoth fueled by a thirst for vengeance, had smashed through the German lines and was now advancing relentlessly across Poland and into the German heartland itself. This was not merely an army advancing. It was an apocalypse in motion. The stories preceding the Soviet advance were the stuff of nightmares, tales of mass slaughter, looting, and brutal retribution against the German civilian population. For the millions of Germans living in the eastern provinces of Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, the choice was simple and stark: flee or die. The magnificent Silesian estate of Kamenz, where Waldemar and Calixta had sought refuge, lay directly in the path of this terrifying onslaught. By early 1945, the distant rumble of Soviet artillery was no longer a rumor from the front, but a constant, menacing presence on the eastern horizon. A tidal wave of human misery, millions of desperate German refugees, mostly women, children, and the elderly, clogged the roads, trudging westward through the snow and ice on foot, in carts, and in any vehicle they could find, strafed by Soviet aircraft and stalked by starvation and frostbite. In April, as the Red Army closed in on their region, the moment came when Waldemar and Calixta had to abandon everything. The Grand Palace with its priceless art and furnishings, the sprawling lands they had managed, the last vestiges of their former life, all had to be left behind to the advancing tide. At 56 years old, Waldemar was no longer just a prince or a landowner. He was a refugee joining the desperate exodus. For a healthy man, the journey would have been an ordeal. For Waldemar, it was an agony. Decades of living with hemophilia had taken their toll. The disease, particularly in the era before modern treatments, often causes repeated bleeding into joints, leading to a crippling and intensely painful form of arthritis. His body was already weakened and worn down. The chaos of the refugee trail offered no proper food, no rest, no shelter from the elements. The physical and mental stress of the flight was immense. Their destination was the small, picturesque town of Tutzing, nestled on the shores of Lake Starnberg, in the relative safety of southern Bavaria, where they hoped to wait out the final, violent collapse of the war. By the time they finally reached Tutzing, Waldemar was in a state of complete physical collapse. The grueling journey had triggered an internal bleeding episode. He was weak, pale, and in desperate need of medical attention. His life now hung by the thinnest of threads. Miraculously, in the chaos of a disintegrating nation, they found help. A local clinic still had a functioning staff and, crucially, a small supply of blood for transfusions. A doctor administered the blood, and for a brief, hopeful moment it seemed to work. The bleeding appeared to stabilize. Calixta, watching by his bedside, must have felt a surge of profound relief. They had escaped the Soviets, they had found medical care, and it seemed that her husband, who had lived his entire life dodging death, would manage to do so one last time. But fate, which had dealt Waldemar such a cruel hand throughout his life, had reserved its final, most ironic blow. On May 1st, 1945, the war arrived in Tutzing, not with the Soviets, but with the vanguard of the U.S. Army. The arrival of the Americans should have signified liberation, safety, and the end of the nightmare. And for the town, it did. But for the man lying in the clinic bed, this moment of liberation would paradoxically become a death sentence. The American Medical Corps that entered the region had an immediate, horrific, and overriding priority that superseded everything else. Just 20 miles away from Tutzing lay the infamous Dachau concentration camp. As the American soldiers liberated the camp, they were confronted with a vision of hell that defied human comprehension. They found thousands of skeletal, emaciated survivors on the brink of death from starvation, typhus, and torture. They found piles of unburied corpses stacked like cordwood. The scenes of utter depravity and inhumanity they witnessed galvanized them into a massive humanitarian rescue operation. Every available doctor, medic, ambulance, and most importantly, every drop of available medical supplies in the entire region had to be mobilized immediately to save the thousands of victims clinging to life at Dachau. This necessary and righteous act of mercy had an unintended and fatal consequence. The U.S. Army took control of all medical facilities and supplies, redirecting them to the immense catastrophe at Dachau. The doctor treating Waldemar at the Tutzing clinic was informed that he could no longer have access to the blood supplies. They were now reserved for the survivors of the Holocaust. Calixta, seeing her husband's condition begin to deteriorate again, pleaded desperately with the American officers. One can imagine her frantic attempts to explain who her husband was: a prince of the old royal house, a man with a rare and life-threatening condition. But in the face of a tragedy on the epic scale of Dachau, the plight of a single ailing aristocrat, a member of the elite from the defeated enemy nation, meant nothing. There was no blood left for a forgotten prince. With his last hope gone, Waldemar's internal bleeding began again, this time with no way to stop it. The curse that had been passed down to him in his royal blood, the relentless enemy that had shadowed his every step since birth, was now closing in for the final time. He had survived the fall of the German Empire. He had lived through the chaos of the Weimar Republic. He had silently endured the tyranny of the Third Reich. He had escaped the onslaught of the Red Army. But here, at the very moment of peace in a quiet Bavarian town, he was defeated. He was not killed by the war, but by its end, not by an act of cruelty, but by an act of compassion directed elsewhere. On May 2, 1945, just 6 days before the final surrender of Germany and the end of the war in Europe, Prince Waldemar of Prussia died from the complications of his hemophilia. He was 56 years old. His death was not recorded in the screaming headlines that announced the fall of Berlin or the death of Hitler. It was a small, lonely death, a quiet whisper lost in the roar of a dying world. Waldemar's lonely death, a tragic footnote in the final chaotic days of a world war, marked the end of a life defined by quiet struggle. He was a man who had survived the fall of an empire and the tyranny of a dictatorship, only to be defeated by a cruel twist of fate at the very moment of peace. With the narrative of his life now complete, all that remains is to look back and ask the essential question: what is the legacy of this forgotten prince? How does his story of silent endurance resonate today? And what meaning can be found in a life lived in the shadow of history? In the immediate aftermath of the war, as Europe began the monumental task of digging itself out from the rubble, the death of a single forgotten prince in a small Bavarian town went almost entirely unnoticed. Prince Waldemar of Prussia was buried in a simple grave. And even here, in his final resting place, his story is shrouded in a quiet ambiguity that seems to reflect the marginal nature of his life. Records in Tutzing indicate he was initially interred in the local forest cemetery, the Waldfriedhof. His wife, Princess Calixta, who survived him by over 2 decades and died in 1967, was buried in Erbach in the state of Hesse. Waldemar's final resting place, however, remains in the forest cemetery of Tutzing. This quiet, separate burial is a fitting postscript for a man who lived his life in the footnotes of the grand historical narrative, a prince whose final whereabouts, like his life's impact, are not clearly marked for posterity. Prince Waldemar of Prussia's life, though a quiet footnote in history, offers a profound lens into the tragedies of his time. He was not a hero of grand battles or political triumphs, yet his story resonates with a timeless significance, inviting us to meditate on the deeper nature of strength, duty, and fate through the experience of a man defined by his limitations. His life serves as a crucial intersection of 2 historical tragedies. As a hemophiliac who lived for 56 years, he embodies the devastating long-term reality of the royal disease that plagued Europe's monarchies. Simultaneously, born into the German Empire's peak, he witnessed the complete collapse of that world, living as a symbol of a fallen aristocracy forced to find meaning after its destiny was erased. Ultimately, Waldemar's legacy is a testament to the quiet courage of endurance. His greatest battle was not fought on a field of honor, but within his own body against the treachery of his blood. His legacy is not written in the histories of empires, but in the silence between the lines, a testament that the greatest strength is not the power to command the world, but the courage to endure one's own.